As far as the North itself, many different divisions were going on, and various different political power plays were at stake here too. Abraham Lincoln was thought by a number of Northern opposition to maybe be some weak Midwest politician, when in fact he wasn't, and he flexed his muscles. Abraham Lincoln believed in the idea of preserving the Union. He did not have any animosity or ire towards the South. He revered the South, and he revered many of the Southern colloquial type aspects. He needed the South. He wanted to preserve the Union. And his approach was not to necessarily upset the South. He just wanted to preserve it as being part of the United States. There's a pretty big distinction there. Um, he did want to preserve the Union, and in doing so, he had to unify Northern opinion about the war. Many people up north dissented against the war. They were like, you know what, let them go. Let them go. Let us be rid of them. Our political ideals are different than theirs, and they're just kind of a stumbling block into what we want in the first place. We have different economic values than they do. Let them go. They'll be out of the way. Abraham Lincoln used many executive powers to basically force Northerners into supporting the war. Um, he would oftentimes overstep what we would see as being freedom or as having freedom, and he would reproach Northerners and perhaps punish them. Anybody protesting would have possible punishment, possibly even being arrested for not supporting the war. Abraham Lincoln did that. Okay, he had um, excellent ideas behind the war, preserving the Union and future ending slavery. But the idea of repressing disloyal Northerners came to the forefront. Also, he had many different ideas for extending popularity for the war itself. Okay, so the actual war had to be paid for in some different ways. And the United States government took out loans, they took out various different bonds, they printed more money, they did all kinds of different things to perhaps pay for the war. They increased taxes on certain products. So that's one way you kind of raise funds for the war. The other thing that they did um, is they wanted to territorialize the territories that they had already had. They gained all that territory in the 1840s. The United States government wanted to maintain its spread. So, in order to populate those western new territories and so as to gain its foothold and maintain it, the United States in 1862 passed the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act. What the Homestead Act did was it enabled United States citizens to maintain and eventually purchase 160-acre tracts of land in various designated areas out west, and they'd be able to pay a small nominal fee for it after they'd been on that land for 5 years. So what you're doing is you're allowing for a settlement of the West in large tracts of lands that would actually be available for people to settle. The Morrill Act of 1862 established modern land grant institutions, colleges whose primary role would be to conduct research for agriculture and engineering. Every state in the Union today has a land grant institution. In the state of Texas, the major land grant institution is Texas A&M University. Okay? As a matter of fact, the A&M, the A in A&M stands for agriculture, the M stands for mechanical. The Agricultural and Mechanical College of Texas was eventually transformed into Texas A&M University in the 1960s. You have Oklahoma State, which used to be Oklahoma A&M. You have LSU, Louisiana State, and A&M University, basically as the land grant institution for the state of Louisiana. You have Kansas State. They used to be the Kansas Aggies. Michigan State, Clemson. you have a land grant institution in every state. So if you see a university that has state in its name, or A&M or A&T or something of that sort, that's typically a designation that it's the land grant institution of that particular state. And they are afforded money from the federal government for agricultural research, engineering development and research, and then of course now extended into air and space research. Okay, so from that standpoint, that is why Texas A&M, yeah, they're called the Aggies. Pretty much every state had a land grant institution that referred to themselves as Aggies. Just Texas A&M's pretty much the only one that's maintained the Aggie moniker. Okay, Oklahoma State used to be Oklahoma A&M, the Oklahoma Aggies. They're now the Oklahoma State Cowboys. But Texas A&M, if you've ever seen why Aggies refer to themselves as the Texas Aggies, that's because they were the Aggies from Texas, whereas Oklahoma A&M, they were the Aggies from Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Aggies. They're now the Oklahoma State Cowboys. Texas A&M kept its A&M moniker and its nickname Aggies. But that's why you see, like in Manhattan, Kansas, you see their bar district, Aggieville. That's not because of Texas A&M. That's because they were the land grant institution in Kansas, and they referred to themselves as Aggies. Aggieville. That's why. Okay. Otherwise, though, the North also built funds for Transcontinental Railroad. Union Pacific, which is an operation to this day, was chartered by the federal government and funded for expansion out west. Further transportation for rail going out west. And then, of course, you also had financing the war itself. I mentioned levying taxes, tariffs, and then also printing money. The federal government started printing what became the modern United States dollar, the greenback, if you will. And if you look at a dollar, you'll see that the front side has George Washington on it. It's got its identification and whatnot. And on the back, it's got its green coloration with its monetary figures and pyramids and whatnot. Okay? So, greenback is also a nickname for a dollar, like bucks. 20 bucks. Well, a greenback is a buck, a dollar. Okay? The United States government started to print more greenbacks to get more money into circulation. Okay, you're seeing that today in our pandemic era, in a sense that the stimulus packages that Congress is passing are intended to spend money in Keynesian theory so as to get money into circulation. So when you have money circulating, you're maintaining your economy. So how do you prevent inflation from getting out of control? That's where taxes come into play. That's why we pay taxes, not just to fund various different products, but to also keep the value of the dollar from getting out of control. So when we're printing money and putting money into the economy, you're maintaining its staggered inflation by way of levying taxes. You're basically keeping it under control. So that's what was going on at the time with the Union financing their war effort. There was only about 16,000 Union troops in the onset of the war. So how do you fight a war when you hardly have an army? Well, you have to have some sort of a draft. So the idea of conscription comes into play around this era. A draft and a mandatory 3-year service comes into play. The draft is nothing new in American history, but really the American Civil War, where Union troops were drafted from the civilian population and therefore trained and service for a number of amount of years or months or however long. It's nothing new, and it starts in the Civil War. And eventually you'd have World War I, World War II, Vietnam, where we had drafts. But the Civil War is where it largely starts. Now, conscription is you're drafted and you're basically forced into service for a specified amount of time. In modern day Israel, all Israeli citizens are forced into conscription. Every Israeli citizen must spend no less than 2 years in the Israeli Defense Force. And as Israel has been attacked twice in its history by its neighboring sovereign nations, they have cause and reason to perhaps maybe defend their way of life. So everyone in Israel will serve in the Israeli Defense Force for no less than 2 years. It's a bit drastic, we would think at least, but given their history, I understand why. Non-surprisingly, though, many Northerners gave pushback to the idea of being forced into service, many of whom disagreed with the war. Many of them disagreed with war in the first place. So you had many different riots where people would not want to succumb to a draft to fight in the Civil War. And New York City would become the epicenter for such movement. So from that standpoint, that parlays into the politics of the era.